Chapter 3. The pond lay to the south of the house. To get there, you went out the back entrance and down the narrow, twisting path, pushing past the overgrown bracken that in the early autumn would still be blocking your way. Or, if there were no guardians around, you could take a shortcut through the rhubarb patch. Anyway, once you came out to the pond, you'd find a tranquil atmosphere waiting, with ducks and bulrushes and pondweed. It wasn't, though, a good place for a discreet conversation. Not nearly as good as the lunch queue. For a start, you could be clearly seen from the house, and the way the sound traveled across the water was hard to predict. If people wanted to eavesdrop, it was the easiest thing to walk down the outer path and crouch in the bushes on the other side of the pond. But since it had been me that had cut him off in the lunch queue, I supposed I had to make the best of it. It was well into October by then, but the sun was out that day, and I decided I could just about make out I'd gone strolling aimlessly down there and happened to come across Tommy. Maybe because I was keen to keep up this impression, though I'd no idea if anyone was actually watching, I didn't try and sit down when I eventually found him seated on a large flat rock not far from the water's edge. It must have been a Friday or a weekend, because I remember we had on our own clothes. I don't remember exactly what Tommy was wearing, probably one of the raggy football shirts he wore even when the weather was chilly. But I definitely had on the maroon tracksuit top that zipped up in the front, which I'd got at a sale in Senior One. I walked round him and stood with my back to the water facing the house, so that I'd see people if they started gathering at the windows. Then for a few minutes we talked about nothing in particular, just like the lunch queue business hadn't happened. I'm not sure if it was for Tommy's benefit or for any onlookers, but I kept my posture looking very provincial, and at one point made a move to carry on with my stroll. I saw a kind of panic cross Tommy's face then, and I immediately felt sorry to have teased him, even though I hadn't meant to. So I said, like I just remembered, "By the way, what was that you were saying about Miss Lucy early on, about her telling you something?" Oh, Tommy gazed past me to the pond, pretending too that this was a topic he'd forgotten all about. Miss Lucy. Oh, that. Miss Lucy was the most sporting of the guardians at Hailsham, though you might not have guessed it from her appearance. She had a squat, almost bulldoggy figure, and her odd black hair, when it grew upwards so it never covered her ears or chunky neck. But she was really strong and fit, and even when we were older, most of us, even the boys, couldn't keep up with her on a field run. She was superb at hockey and could even hold her own with the senior boys on the football pitch. I remember watching once when James B. tried to trip her as she went past him with the ball, and he was the one sent flying instead. When we'd been in the juniors, she'd never been someone like Miss Geraldine who you turned to when you were upset. In fact, she didn't tend to speak much to us when we were younger. It was only in the seniors, really, we started to appreciate her brisk style. "You were saying something," I said to Tommy. "Something about Miss Lucy telling you it was all right not to be creative?" Tommy said, "She did say something like that. She said I shouldn't worry. Not mind what other people were saying a couple months ago now, maybe longer." Over at the house, a few juniors had stopped at one of the upstairs windows and were watching us. But I now crouched down in front of Tommy, no longer pretending anything. "Tommy, that's a funny thing for her to say. Are you sure you got it right?" His voice lowered. "Of course I got it right. She didn't just say it once. We were in her room and she gave me a whole talk about it." When she'd first asked him to come to her study after art appreciation, he'd expected yet another lecture about how he should try harder. The sort of thing he had already heard from various guardians, including Miss Emily herself. But as they were walking from the house towards the orangery, where the guardians had their living quarters, Tommy began to get an inkling that this was something different. Then, once he was seated in Miss Lucy's easy chair, she remained standing by the window, she asked him to tell her the whole story as he saw it of what had been happening to him. So, Tommy had begun going through it all. But before he was even halfway, she'd suddenly broken in and started to talk herself. She'd known a lot of students, she said, who'd for a long time found it very difficult to be creative. Painting, drawing, poetry, none of it going right for years. Then one day, they'd turn a corner and blossomed. It was quite possible Tommy was one of these. Tommy had heard all this before, but there was something about Miss Lucy's manner that made him keep listening harder. I could tell, he told me, she was leading up to something different. Sure enough, she was soon saying things Tommy found difficult to follow, but she kept repeating it until eventually he began to understand. If Tommy had genuinely tried, she was saying, but he just couldn't be very creative, then that was quite all right. He wasn't to worry about it. It was wrong for anyone, whether they were students or guardians, to punish him for it or put pressure on him in any way. It simply wasn't his fault. And when Tommy had protested it was all very well Ms. Lucy saying this, but everyone did think it was his fault, she'd given a sigh and looked out of her window. And then she said, "It may not help you very much, but just you remember this. There's at least one person here at Hailsham who believes otherwise. At least one person who believes you're a very good student, as good as any she's ever come across, never mind how creative you are." She wasn't having you on, was she? I asked Tommy. It wasn't some clever way of telling you off. Tommy said it definitely wasn't like that. Anyway, for the first time he seemed worried about being overheard and glanced over his shoulder toward the house. The juniors at the window had lost interest and gone. Some girls from our year were walking toward the pavilion, but they were still a good way off. Tommy turned back to me and said, almost in a whisper, "Anyway, when she was saying all this, she was shaking." I said, "What do you mean shaking?" "She was shaking with rage. I could see her. She was furious, but furious deep inside." I asked, "Who at?" Tommy said, "I wasn't sure. Not at me anyway. That was the most important thing." He gave a laugh, then became serious again. "I don't know who she was angry with, but she was angry." I stood up because my calves were aching. It's pretty weird, Tommy. The funny thing is, though, this talk with her did helped a lot. When you were saying earlier on about how things seem better for me now, well, it's because of that. Because afterwards, thinking about what she'd said, I realized she was right, that it wasn't my fault. Okay, I hadn't handled it well, but deep down, it wasn't my fault. That's what made the difference. And whenever I felt rocky about it, I'd catch sight of her walking about, or it'd be in one of her lessons, and she wouldn't say anything about our talk, but I'd look at her, and she'd sometimes see me and give me a little nod. And that's all I needed. You were asking earlier if something had happened. Well, that's what happened. But Kath, listen, don't breathe a word to anyone about this, all right? I nodded, but asked, "Did she make you promise that?" "Oh, no. She didn't make me promise anything. But you're not to breathe a word. You've got to really promise." "All right," I said. The girls heading for the pavilion had spotted me and were waving and calling. I waved back and said to Tommy, "I'd better go. We can talk more about it soon." But Tommy ignored this. "There's something else," he went on. "Something else," she said, "I can't quite figure out. I was going to ask you about it. She said we weren't being taught enough, something like that." I said, "Taught enough? You mean she thinks we should be studying even harder than we are?" "No, I don't think she meant that. What she was talking about was, about us, what's going to happen to us one day, donations and all that." I said, "But we have been taught about all that." I wonder what she meant. Does she think there are things we haven't been told yet? Tommy thought for a moment, then shook his head. I don't think she meant it like that. She just thinks we aren't taught about it enough, because she said she'd a good mind to talk to us about it herself. Well, about what exactly? He said, "I'm not sure. Maybe I got it all wrong, Kath. I don't know. Maybe she was meaning something else completely, something else to do with me not being creative. I don't really understand it." Tommy was looking at me as though he expected me to come up with an answer. I went on thinking for a few seconds, then said, "Tommy, think back carefully. You said she got angry." "Well, that's what it looked like. She was quiet, but she was shaking." "All right, whatever. Let's say she got angry. Was it when she got angry she started to say this other stuff about how we weren't taught enough about donations and the rest of it? Tommy said, I suppose so. Now, Tommy, think. Why did she bring it up? She's talking about you and you not creating. Then suddenly she starts up about this other stuff. What's the link? Why did she bring up donations? What's that got to do with you being creative? I don't know, Kath. There must have been some reason, I suppose. Maybe one thing reminded her of the other. Kath, you're getting really worked up about this yourself now. I laughed because he was right. I'd been frowning, completely lost in my thoughts. The fact was, my mind was going in various directions at once, and Tommy's account of his talk with Miss Lucy had reminded me of something, perhaps a whole series of things, little incidents from the past to do with Miss Lucy that had puzzled me at the time. It's just that I stopped and sighed. I can't quite put it right, not even to myself, but all this, what you're saying, it sort of fits with a lot of other things that are puzzling. I keep thinking about all these things, like why Madam comes and takes away our best pictures. What's that for exactly? He said, it's for the gallery. And I said, but what is her gallery? She keeps coming here, taking away our best work. She must have stacks of it by now. I asked Miss Geraldine once how long Madam's been coming here, and she said for as long as Hailsham's been here. What is this gallery? Why should she have a gallery of things done by us? He said maybe she sells them outside, out there. They sell everything. I shook my head. That can't be. It's got something to do with what Miss Lucy said to you about us, about how one day we'll start giving donations. I don't know why, but I've had this feeling for some time now that it's all linked in, though I can't figure out how. I'll have to go now, Tommy. Let's not tell anyone yet about what we've been saying. No, he said, and don't tell anyone about Miss Lucy. But Tommy, will you tell me if she says anything else to you like that? Tommy nodded, then glanced around him again. Like you say, you'd better go, Kath. Someone's going to hear us. The gallery Tommy and I were discussing was something we'd all grown up with. Everyone talked about it as though it existed, though in truth, none of us knew for sure that it did. I'm sure I was pretty typical in not being able to remember how or when I'd first heard about it. Certainly it hadn't been from the Guardians. They never mentioned the gallery, and there was an unspoken rule that we should never even raise the subject in their presence. I suppose now it was something passed down through the different generation of Hailsham students. I remember a time when I could only have been 5 or 6, sitting at a low table beside Amanda C., our hands clammy with modeling clay. I can't remember if there were other children with us or which guardian was in charge. All I remember is Amanda C., who was a year older than me, looking at what I was making and exclaiming, "That's really, really good, Kathy. That's so good. I bet that'll get in the gallery." I must by then have already known about the gallery because I remember the excitement and pride when she said that. And then the next moment thinking to myself, that's ridiculous. None of us are good enough for the gallery yet. As we got older, we went on talking about the gallery. If you wanted to praise someone's work, you'd say, that's good enough for the gallery. And after we discovered irony, whenever we came across any laughably bad work, we'd go, oh yes, straight to the gallery with that one. But did we really believe in the gallery? Today, I'm not sure. As I've said, we never mentioned it to the Guardians, and looking back, it seems to me this was a rule we imposed on ourselves as much as anything the Guardians had decided. There's an instance I can remember from when we were about 11. We were in room 7 on a sunny winter's morning. We'd just finished Mr. Rogers' class, and a few of us had stayed on to chat with him. We were sitting up on our desks, and I can't remember exactly what we were talking about, but Mr. Roger, as usual, was making us laugh and laugh. Then Carol H. had said through her giggles, "You might even get it picked for the gallery." She immediately put her hand over her mouth with an oops, and the atmosphere remained lighthearted. But we all knew, Mr. Roger included, that she'd made a mistake. Not a disaster exactly. It would have been much the same had one of us let slip a rude word or used a Guardian's nickname to his or her face. Mr. Mr. Rogers smiled indulgently as though to say, "Let it pass, we'll pretend you never said that," and we carried on as before. If for us the gallery remained in a hazy realm, what was solid enough fact was Madam's turning up usually twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times each year to select from our best work. We called her Madam because she was French or Belgian. There was a dispute as to which. And that was what the Guardians always called her. She was a tall, narrow woman with short hair, probably quite young still, though at the time we wouldn't have thought of her as such. She always wore a sharp gray suit, and unlike the gardeners, unlike the drivers who brought in our supplies, unlike virtually anyone else who came in from outside, she wouldn't talk to us and kept us at a distance with her chilly look. For years we thought of her as snooty, but then one night around when we were 8, Ruth came up with another theory. "She's scared of us," she declared. We were lying in the dark in our dorm. In the juniors, we were 15 to a dorm, so didn't tend to have the sort of long, intimate conversations we did once we got to the seniors. But most of what had become our group had beds close enough by then, and we were already getting the habit of talking into the night. "What do you mean scared of us?" someone asked. "How can she be scared of us? What could we do to her?" "I don't know," Ruth said. "I don't know. But I'm sure she is. I used to think she was just snooty, but it's something else. I'm sure of it now. Madam's scared of us." We argued about this on and off for the next few days. Most of us didn't agree with Ruth, but then that just made her all the more determined to prove she was right. So in the end, we settled on a plan to put her theory to the test the next time Madam came to Hailsham. Although Madam's visits were never announced, it was always pretty obvious when she was due. The lead up to her arrival began weeks before, with guardians sifting through all our work, our painting, sketching, pottery, all our essays and poems. This usually went on for at least a fortnight, by the end of which 4 or 5 items from each junior and senior year would have ended up in the billiards room. The billiards room would get closed during this period, but if you stood on the low wall of the terrace outside, you'd be able to see through the windows the haul of stuff getting larger and larger. Once the guardians started laying it out neatly on tables and easels, like a miniature version of one of our exchanges, then you knew Madam would be coming within a day or 2. The autumn I'm now talking about, we needed to know not just the day, but the precise moment Madam turned up, since she often stayed no longer than an hour or 2. So as soon as we saw the stuff getting displayed in the billiards room, we decided to take turns keeping lookout. This was a task made much easier by the way the grounds were laid out. Hailsham stood in a smooth hollow with fields rising on all sides. That meant that from almost any of the classroom windows in the main house, and even from the pavilion, you had a good view of the long, narrow road that came down across the fields and arrived at the main gate. The gate itself was still a fair distance off, and any vehicle would then have to take the graveled drive, going past shrubs and flower beds before at last reaching the courtyard in front of the main house. Days could sometimes go by without us seeing a vehicle coming down that narrow road, and the ones that did were usually vans or lorries bringing supplies, gardeners, or workmen. A car was a rarity, and the sight of one in a distance was sometimes enough to cause bedlam during a class. The afternoon Madam's car was spotted coming across the fields. It was windy and sunny, with a few storm clouds starting to gather. We were in room 9 on the first floor at the front of the house, and when the whisper went around, poor Mr. Frank, who was trying to teach us spelling, couldn't understand why we'd suddenly got so restless. The plan we'd come up with was to test Ruth's theory. The plan we'd come up with to test Ruth's theory was very simple. We, the 6 of us in on it, would lie in wait for Madam somewhere, then swarm out all around her all at once. We'd all remain perfectly civilized and just go on our way, but if we timed it right and she was taken off guard, we'd see. Ruth insisted that she was really afraid of us. Our main worry was that we just wouldn't get an opportunity during the short time she was at Hailsham. But as Mr. Frank's class drew to an end, we could see Madam directly below in the courtyard, parking her car. We had a hurried conference out on the landing, then followed the rest of the class down the stairs and loitered just inside the main doorway. We could see out into the bright courtyard where Madame was still sitting behind the wheel, rummaging in her briefcase. Eventually, she emerged from the car and came toward us, dressed in her usual gray suit, her briefcase held tightly to herself in both arms. At a signal from Ruth, we all sauntered out, moving straight for her, but like we were all in a dream. Only when she came to a stiff halt did we each murmur, "Excuse me, miss," and separate. I'll never forget the strange change that came over us the next instant. Until that point, this whole thing about Madame had been, if not a joke exactly, very much a private thing we'd wanted to settle among ourselves. We hadn't thought much about how Madame herself, or anyone else, would come into it. What I mean is, until then, it had been a pretty light-hearted matter, with a bit of a dare element to it. And it wasn't even as though Madame did anything other than what we predicted she'd do. She just froze and waited for us to pass by. She didn't shriek or even let out a gasp. But we were all so keenly tuned into picking up her response, and that's probably why it had such an effect on us. As she came to a halt, I glanced quickly at her face, as did the others, I'm sure. And I can still see it now. The shudder she seemed to be suppressing, the real dread that one of us would accidentally brush against her. And though we just kept on walking, we all felt it. It was like we'd walked from the sun right into chilly shade. Ruth had been right. Madame was afraid of us. But she was afraid of us in the same way someone might be afraid of spiders. We hadn't been ready for that. It had never occurred to us to wonder how we would feel being seen like that, being like spiders. By the time we crossed the courtyard and reached the grass, we were a very different group from the one that had stood about excitedly waiting for Madame to get out of her car. Hannah looked ready to burst into tears. Even Ruth looked really shaken. Then one of us, I think it was Laura, said, "If she doesn't like us, why does she want our work? Why doesn't she just leave us alone? Who asks her to come here anyway?" No one answered, and we carried on over to the pavilion, not saying anything more about what had happened. Thinking back now, I can see we were just at that age when we knew a few things about ourselves, about who we were, how we were different from our guardians, from the people outside, but hadn't yet understood what any of it meant. I'm sure somewhere in your childhood, you too had an experience like ours that day, similar, if not in the actual details, then inside in the feelings. Because it doesn't really matter how well your guardians try to prepare you. All the talks, videos, discussions, warnings, none of that can really bring it home. Not when you're 8 years old and you're all together in a place like Hailsham, when you've got guardians like the ones we had, when the gardeners and the delivery men joke and laugh with you and call you sweetheart. All the same, some of it must go in somewhere. It must go in because by the time a moment like that comes along, there's a part of you that's been waiting. Maybe from as early as when you're 5 or 6, but there's been a whisper going at the back of your head saying, one day, maybe not so long from now, you'll get to know how it feels. So you're waiting, even if you don't quite know it, waiting for the moment when you realize that you really are different to them. That there are people out there like Madame who don't hate you or wish you any harm, but who nevertheless shudder at the very thought of you, of how you were brought into this world and why, and who dread the idea of your hand brushing against theirs. The first time you glimpse yourself through the eyes of a person like that, it's a cold moment. It's like walking past a mirror you've walked past every day of your life, and suddenly it shows you something else, something troubling and strange. Chapter 4. I won't be a carer anymore come the end of the year, and though I've got a lot out of it, I have to admit I'll welcome the chance to rest, to stop and think and remember. I'm sure it's at least partly to do with that, to do with preparing for the change of pace that I've been getting this urge to order all these old memories. What I really wanted, I suppose, was to get straight all the things that happened between me and Tommy and Ruth after we grew up and left Hailsham. But I realize now just how much of what occurred later came out of our time at Hailsham. And that's why I want first to go over these early memories quite carefully. Take all this curiosity about Madam, for instance. At one level, it was just us kids larking about. But at another, as you'll see, it was the start of a process that kept growing and growing over the years until it came to dominate our lives. After that day, mention of Madam became, well, not taboo exactly, pretty rare among us. And this was something that soon spread beyond our little group to just about all the students in our year. We were, I'd say, as curious as ever about her, but we all sensed that to probe any further about what she did with our work, whether there really was a gallery, would get us into territory we weren't ready for yet. The topic of the gallery, though, still cropped up every once in a while, so that when a few years later Tommy started telling me beside the pond about his odd talk with Lucy, I found something tugging away at my memory. It was only afterwards, when I'd left him sitting on his rock and was hurrying toward the fields to catch up with my friends, that it came back to me. It was something Miss Lucy had once said to us during a class. I'd remembered it because it had puzzled me at the time, and also because it was one of the few occasions when the gallery had been mentioned so deliberately in front of a guardian. We'd been in the middle of what we later came to call the tokens controversy. Tommy and I discussed the tokens controversy a few years ago, and we couldn't first agree when it had happened. I said we'd been 10 at the time, but he thought it was later. But in the end, he came around to agreeing with me. I'm pretty sure I got it right. We were in junior 4, a while after that incident with Madam, but still 3 years before our talk by the pond. The tokens controversy was, I suppose, all part of our getting more acquisitive as we got older. For years, I think I've said this already, we thought that having work chosen from the billiards room, never mind taken away by Madam, was a huge triumph. But by the time we were 10, we'd grown more ambivalent about it. The exchanges, with their systems of tokens as currency, had given us a keen eye for pricing up anything we produced. We'd become preoccupied with t-shirts, with decorating around our beds, with personalizing our desks, and of course we had our collections to think of. I don't know if you had collections where you were. When you come across old students from Hailsham, you'll always find them sooner or later getting nostalgic about their collections. At the time, of course, you took it all for granted. You each had a wooden chest with your name on it, which you kept under your bed and filled with your possessions, the stuff you acquired from the sales or the exchanges. I can remember 1 or 2 students not bothering much with their collections, but most of us took enormous care, bringing things out to display, putting other things away carefully. The point is, by the time we were 10, this whole notion that it was a great honor to have something taken by Madam collided with a feeling that we were losing our most marketable stuff. This all came to a head in the tokens controversy. It began with a number of students, mainly boys, muttering that we should get tokens to compensate when Madam took something away. A lot of students agreed with this, but others were outraged by the idea. Arguments went on between us for some time, and then one day Roy J., who was a year above us and had had a number of things taken by Madam, decided to go and see Miss Emily about it. Miss Emily, our head guardian, was older than the others. She wasn't especially tall, but something about the way she carried herself, always very straight with her head right up, made you think she was. She wore her silvery hair tied back, but strands were always coming loose and floating around her. They would have driven me mad, but Miss Emily always ignored them like they were beneath her contempt. By the evening, she was a pretty strange sight, with bits of loose hair everywhere, which she wouldn't even bother to push away from her face when she talked to you. We were all pretty scared of her and didn't think of her in the way we did the other guardians, but we considered her to be fair and respected her decisions. And even in the juniors, we probably recognized that it was her presence, intimidating though it was, that made us all feel so safe at Hailsham. It took some nerve to go and see her without being summoned. To go with the sort of demands Roy was making seemed suicidal. But Roy didn't get the terrible telling off we were expecting, and in the days that followed, there were reports of guardians talking, even arguing, about the tokens question. In the end, it was announced that we would get tokens, but not many, because it was a most distinguished honor to have work selected by Madam. This didn't really go down well with either camp, and the arguments rumbled on. It was against this background that Polly T. asked Miss Lucy the question that morning. We were in the library, sitting around the big oak table. I remember there was a log burning in the fireplace, and they were doing a play reading. At some point, a line in the play had led to Laura making a wisecrack about the tokens business, and we'd all laughed, Miss Lucy included. Then Miss Lucy had said that since everyone at Halshen was talking about little else, we should forget the play reading and spend the rest of the lesson exchanging our views about the tokens. And that's what we were doing when Polly asked, completely out of the blue, Miss, why does Madam take our things anyway? We all went silent. Miss Lucy didn't often get cross, but when she did, you certainly knew about it, and we thought for a second Polly was in for it. But then we saw Miss Lucy wasn't angry, just deep in thought. I remember feeling furious at Polly for so stupidly breaking the unwritten rule, but at the same time being terribly excited about what answer Miss Lucy might give. And clearly I wasn't the only one with these mixed emotions. Virtually everyone shot daggers at Polly before turning eagerly to Miss Lucy, which was, I suppose, pretty unfair on poor Polly. After what seemed a very long time, Miss Lucy said, all I can tell you today is that it's for a good reason, a very important reason. But if I tried to explain it to you now, I don't think you'd understand. One day, I hope, it'll be explained to you. We didn't press her. The atmosphere around the table had become one of deep embarrassment, and curious as we were to hear more, we wanted most for the talk to get away from this dodgy territory. The next moment, then, we were all relieved to be arguing again, a bit artificially perhaps, about the tokens. But Miss Lucy's words had puzzled me, and I kept thinking about them on and off for the next few days. That's why that afternoon by the pond, when Tommy was telling me about his talk with Miss Lucy, about how she'd said to him we weren't being taught enough about some things, the memory of that time in the library, along with maybe one or two other little episodes like that, started tugging at my mind. Oh, no, wait. Chapter 4. While we're on the subject of the tokens, I just want to say a bit about our sales, which I've mentioned a few times already. The sales were important to us because that's how we got hold of things from outside. Tommy's polo shirt, for instance, that came from a sale. That's where we got our clothes, our toys, the special things that hadn't been made by another student. Once every month, a big white van would come down that long road, and you'd feel the excitement all through the house and grounds. By the time it pulled up in the courtyard, there'd be a crowd waiting, mainly juniors, because once you were past 12 or 13, it wasn't the thing to be getting so obviously excited. But the truth was we all were. Looking back now, it's funny to think we got so worked up. Because the sales were usually a big disappointment. There'd be nothing remotely special, and we'd just spend our tokens renewing stuff that was wearing out or broken with more of the same. But the point was, I suppose, we'd all of us in the past found something at a sale, something that had become special. A jacket, a watch, a pair of craft scissors never used but kept proudly next to a bed. We'd all found something like that at one time. And so, however much we tried to pretend otherwise, we couldn't ever shake off the old feelings of hope and excitement. Actually, there was some point hanging about the van as it was being unloaded. What you did, if you were one of the juniors, was to follow back and forth from the storeroom the two men in overalls carrying the big cardboard boxes, asking them what was inside. "A lot of goodies, sweetheart," was the usual reply. Then if you kept asking, wait, but is it a bumper crop? They'd sooner or later smile and say, oh, I'd say so, sweetheart, a real bumper crop, bringing a thrilled cheer. The boxes were often open at the top, so you'd catch glimpses of all kinds of things. And sometimes, though they weren't really supposed to, the med would let you move a few items about for a better look. And that was why, by the time of the actual sale a week or so later, all sorts of rumors would be going around, maybe about a particular tracksuit or a music cassette. And if there was trouble, it was almost always because a few students had set their hearts on the same item. The sales were a complete contrast to the hushed atmosphere of the exchanges. They were held in the dining hall and were crowdy and noisy. In fact, the pushing and shouting was all part of the fun, and they stayed for the most part pretty good-humored. Except, as I say, every now and then things would get out of hand, with students grabbing and tugging, sometimes fighting. Then the monitors would threaten to close the whole thing down, and we'd all of us have to face a talking to from Miss Emily at assembly the next morning. Our day at Hailsham always began with an assembly, which was usually pretty brief, a few announcements, maybe a poem read out by a student. Miss Emily didn't often say much. She'd just sit very straight on the stage, nodding at whatever was being said, occasionally turning a frosty eye toward any whispering in the crowd. But on a morning after a rowdy sale, everything was different. She'd order us to sit down on the floor. We usually stood at assemblies, and there'd be no announcements or performances, just Miss Emily talking to us for 20, 30 minutes, sometimes even longer. She'd rarely raise her voice, but there was something steely about her on these occasions, and none of us, not even the senior fives, dared make a sound. There was a real sense of feeling bad that we had in some collective way let down Miss Emily, but try as we might, we couldn't really follow these lectures. It was partly her language, unworthy of privilege, and misuse of opportunity. These were two regular phrases Ruth and I came up with when we were reminiscing in her room at the center in Dover. Her general drift was clear enough. We were all very special, being Hailsham students, and so it was all the more disappointing when we behaved badly. Beyond that, though, things became a fog. Sometimes she'd be going on very intensely, then come to a sudden stop with something like, "What is it? What is it? What can it be that thwarts us?" Then she'd stand there, eyes closed, a frown on her face like she was trying to puzzle out the answer. And although we felt bewildered and awkward, we'd sit there willing her on to make whatever discovery was needed in her head. She might then resume with a gentle sigh, a signal that we were going to be forgiven, or just as easily explode out of her silence with, "But I will not be coerced. Oh no, and neither will Hailsham." When we were remembering these long speeches, Ruth remarked how odd it was they should have been so unfathomable, since Miss Emily in a classroom could be as clear as anything. When I mentioned how I'd sometimes seen the head wandering around Hailsham in a dream talking to herself, Ruth took offense, saying, "She was never like that. How could Hailsham have been the way it was if the person in charge had been potty? Miss Emily had an intellect you could slice logs with." I didn't argue. Certainly Miss Emily could be uncannily sharp. If, say, you were somewhere you shouldn't be in the main house or on the grounds, and you heard a guardian coming, you could often hide somewhere. Hailsham was full of hiding places, indoors and out. Cupboards, nooks, bushes, hedges. But if you saw Miss Emily coming, your heart sank, because she'd always know you were there hiding. It was like she had some extra sense. You could go into a cupboard, close the door tight, and not move a muscle. And you just knew Miss Emily's footsteps would stop outside, and her voice would say, "All right, out you come." That was what had happened to Sylvie C. once on the second floor landing, and on that occasion Miss Emily had gone into one of her rages. She never shouted like, say, Miss Lucy did when she got mad at you, but if anything, Miss Emily getting angry was scarier. Her eyes narrowed and she'd whisper furiously to herself, like she was discussing with an invisible colleague what punishment was awful enough for you. The way she did it meant half of you was dying to hear and the other half completely not wanting to. But usually with Miss Emily, nothing too awful would come out of it. She hardly ever put you in detention, made you do chores, or withdrew privileges. All the same, you felt dreadful, just knowing you'd fallen in her estimation, and you wanted to do something straight away to redeem yourself. But the thing was, there was no predicting with Miss Emily. Sylvie might have got a portion that time, but when Laura got caught running through the rhubarb patch, Miss Emily just snapped. "Shouldn't be here, girl, off you go," and walked on. And then there was the time I thought I was in hot water with her. The little footpath that went all around the back of the main house was a real favorite of mine. It followed all the nooks, all the extensions. You had to squeeze past shrubs. You went under 2 ivy-covered arches and through a rusted gate. And all the time you could peer in through the windows one after the other. I suppose part of the reason I liked the path so much because I was never sure if it was out of bounds. Certainly when classes were going on, you weren't supposed to walk past. But at the weekends or in the evenings, that was never clear. Most students avoided it anyway, and maybe the feeling of getting away from everyone else was another part of the appeal. In any case, I was doing this little walk one sunny evening. I think I was in Senior 3. As usual, I was glancing into the empty rooms as I went past. And then suddenly I was looking into a classroom with Miss Emily in it. She was alone, pacing slowly, talking under her breath, pointing and directing remarks to an invisible audience in the room. I assumed she was rehearsing a lesson or maybe one of her assembly talks, and I was about to hurry past before she spotted me, but then she turned and looked straight at me. I froze, thinking I was for it, but then noticed she was carrying on as before, except now she was mouthing her address to me. Then, natural as you like, she turned away to fix her gaze on some other imaginary student in another part of the room. I crept away along the path, and for the next day or so, kept dreading what Miss Emily would say when she saw me, but she never mentioned it at all. But that's not really what I want to talk about just now. What I want to do now is get a few things down about Ruth, about how we met and became friends, about our early days together. Because more and more of these days, I'll be driving past fields on a long afternoon, or maybe drinking coffee in front of a huge window in a service station, and I'll catch myself thinking about her again. She wasn't someone I was friends with from the start. I can remember at 5 or 6 doing things with Hannah and with Laura, but not with Ruth. I only have the one vague memory of Ruth from that early part of our lives. I'm playing in a sandpit. There are a number of others in the sand with me. It's too crowded and we're getting irritated with each other. We're in the open under a warm sun, so it's probably the sandpit in the infants' play area, just possibly it's the sand at the end of the long jump in the north playing field. Anyway, it's hot and I'm feeling thirsty, and I'm not pleased there are so many of us in the sandpit. Then Ruth is standing there, not in the sand with the rest of us, but a few feet away. She's very angry with 2 of the girls somewhere behind me about something that must have happened before, and she's standing there glaring at them. My guess is that I knew Ruth only very slightly at that point, but she must already have made some impression on me, because I remember carrying on busily with whatever I was doing in the sand, absolutely dreading the idea of her turning her gaze on me. I didn't say a word, but I was desperate for her to realize I wasn't with the girls behind me, and had had no part in whatever it was that had made her cross. And that's all I remember of Ruth from that early time. We were the same year, so we must have run into each other enough, but aside from the sandpit incident, I just don't remember having anything to do with her until the juniors a couple years later, when we were 7 going on 8.